Good evening, and welcome to a special event that's being hosted by the Robert Schuman Center in collaboration with the Società Italiana di Scienza Politica and the Conference Group on Italian Politics and Societies of the American Political Science Association. My name is Eric Jones, and in addition to being director of the Robert Schuman Center, I also have the great privilege of being the rotating president of CONGRIPS, which is that conference group I just mentioned. What we're trying to do to bring the study of political science together across the Atlantic and to focus its attention on developments in Italy is to bring issues of the day that are of high importance into this kind of a public arena. And I think there is no issue more important in Italy right now than what this country is going to do with the enormous amount of money that needs to be invested in the rejuvenation and the reinforcement of its economy. Having said that, I think we've assembled a crackerjack team led by my colleague David Bocconi, who will be master of ceremonies for this evening. I just want to close by thanking David, Sir Bernstein, and our conference unit at the Robert Schuman Center. David, over to you, man.
Thank you very much, Eric. I'm David Bocconi, research fellow at the SPS department, focused on welfare state reform and the role of the EU. I have last year also done a number of comparative studies on the implementation of the RRF, and I noticed that when I was discussing my findings with policymakers or with other academics, and I was explaining about Slovakia or Croatia or Greece, that all the questions were all about Italy and how is it going with the Italian plan. So when this book came out, I was very happy, but I also was immediately convinced that it would be good to have a discussion also in English for a wider audience, those who don't speak Italian. So I'm very happy that we have with us today Tito, Boeri, and Roberto Perotti, who will discuss their book with the provocative title La Grande Abbuffata, which we have translated as The Great Binge. I have to say it's quite a sobering read, but very well researched, and it certainly raises a number of very important issues. As a short introduction, Tito Boeri is professor and head of the economics department at Bocconi University in Milan, senior visiting professor at the NSE, and he has been senior economist at the OECD, consultant at the IMF, World Bank, EU, ILO, as well as the Italian government. And we have also Roberto Perotti, who is professor of economics at Bocconi University. He did his PhD in economics at MIT. He taught at Columbia University. He's an associate of the CEPR and NBER, and he's a regular contributor to the Italian daily Repubblica. Tito and Boeri will present for about 25 minutes, and then we'll move on to our two excellent discussants. We have Manuela, Moschella, and Laura Polverari, who will each get 10 minutes to respond. Manuela Moschella is Associate Professor of International Political Economy at the Scuola Normale Superiore here in Florence, and her research focuses on the relationship between technocracy and politics, but she's also written about the Italian Recovery Fund. And we have, last but not least, Laura Polverari, who's Associate Professor in Political Science at the University of Padua. And she's an expert in administrative capacity, public administration reforms, primarily in the context of cohesion funds, which also makes her an excellent commentator on the internal complexities of the RRF. Before we start, two short service announcements. So first, this is an open Zoom, so please make sure that you are muted unless you're speaking. And secondly, there will be a Q&A at the end. So if you have a very short question, you can simply type out your question and I will read it. But if you want to ask a question, just announce that you want to ask a question and I will call out your name and unmute you. And make sure that you keep it a bit short, and please don't forget to put yourself on mute again afterwards. Now, before further ado, I suggest I give the floor over to Roberto and Tito. You can share your screen, Roberto.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting us to this very interesting event. This short talk will not be about the big topic right now in Italy, which is the delays in the implementation of the recovery fund. In our view, this is not the main problem of PNRR, so I will use the Italian acronym. We wish it were the main problem, but unfortunately, it's not the main problem. So just to put things in perspective, so here is the size of the recovery fund program in Italy and in the main countries in Europe. So as you can see, it is much bigger than in the other countries. Spain also got a lot of loans, although not as much as Italy. France and Germany only got the grants, of course, because these are free, and decided not to take up any loan. So as a consequence, you can see that Italy, the Italian program is almost 200 billion euros, although in reality it's actually 240 billion euros because it was complemented with funds from the Italian government. And in Germany, it's about 30 billion. So it's about 1/8 of the Italian program. As a share of GDP, the Italian program with 13.2% is the largest one after Greece. So it's a lot of money, a lot of money. So why did Italy decide to take up so much money? We think there are several reasons. One is the political narrative. So the idea was, well, by showing both to Europe and to the Italian population that the government is taking up so much money, the government thought at the time that it would be showing also that Europe, in some sense, was having a lot of faith in the Italian government. This is actually not correct because the formula for the allocation of funds is exactly in a sense the opposite. So the bigger your recession, your COVID recession, and the higher your unemployment rate, so the worse your economy was doing, the more money, the more recovery fund money you had access to. The second reason is a recurrent reason in the Italian debate, which is this time is different. It's a big push. We need a big push. So to implement a big push, we need a lot of money. We know that in the past, big pushes didn't work, but this time, like all the other times, this time is different. And we know how these things end up. The third reason is an unrealistic and often unbelievable estimates of the effects of both the reforms and the investment of the PNRR. And we'll come back to that. But as we'll see, the numbers are truly astonishing. If you believe these numbers, you would believe virtually anything. We are talking about estimated effects of several trillion euros against the cost of reforms of a few billion euros. The fourth reason is that it was widely assumed in the debate that this money was mostly free. In a sense, obviously the grants were free, although they're not totally free, because it's true that Italy was getting grants from the rest of Europe, which are free, but it's also paying for the grants to the rest of Europe, which it pays about 17% of the whole amount allocated in grants to the other European countries. So the difference between the two is not the 70 billion euros in grants that Italy is getting, but it's about half of that. So the true amount of free money that Italy was getting was about 35 billion euros. The rest is loans, and it was widely assumed, for some reason that we cannot actually understand, that because the interest rate was at the time close to zero, well, a zero interest rate was widely equated in the debate to a free gift from Europe, which of course is wrong, because you don't have to pay interest if the interest rate is literally zero, but you have to pay back the principal. On top of that, the interest rate was not truly zero, and is not truly zero now. The difference is about, relative to the debt issued by the Italian government, is about 1.2 percentage points, which is not trivial, but it's not huge. And you still have to justify why you would want to borrow 130 billion euros at an interest rate which is lower by 1 percentage point than the interest rate the Italian government would borrow, and you would not want to borrow any amount at the Italian government interest rate. It's not easy. It's not an easy exercise to do. And finally, we think that the Commission played a big role. Essentially, the Commission was looking for customers. So it had this big program, 700 billion euros, and it would look bad if it didn't have customers. And Italy was the biggest customer. Germany and France were not customers. They announced that they would not take up loans. Spain at the beginning decided they would not take up loans. It decided only the last day, August 31st, 2023. Italy, from the beginning, from day one, announced that it would take up the whole amount. And we think, and the government at the time was, let's say, not a very experienced government. And we think that and we have some evidence, informal evidence, that the Commission played a substantial role in convincing the government at the time to take up as much as possible, all the amount that it could get. One second. What are the main problems? There was too little time to plan, about 9 months between the time the government announced that it would participate in the program and the time that it had to present the final draft. And there is too little time to spend the money well, 3-4 years maximum. We think that any organization, whether private or public, even the best organization in the world, would have trouble spending so much money relative to its gross domestic product. There is a limit to the capacity to spend of any organization. Most local authorities in Italy were not and are not able to spend enormous amount of money and enormous amount of, will not be able to implement effectively the enormous amount of procurement that this money, this flow of money implies. Most of the Italian local governments are small, and they just don't have the professional capacity to run the procurement that this amount of money implies. Could the government have made a different decision? Well, the standard story is that the government cannot renounce any amount that it has decided, that it was decided in April 2021 when the final draft was presented and approved. And but that's not true. We know for a fact that the Italian government can reduce or scrap totally any investment at any time. Not only that, but this would reduce the debt to the Commission, but would not reduce the grants. So the Italian government could have changed things once it recognized that not everything was going smoothly, but for several reasons, mostly we think for prestige reasons, it decided not to take any action. One problem of the PNRR was that it started with unrealistic targets. So we have several examples. So take the reform of the justice system. Its plan was to hire 19,000 people for 3 years to help the justice system to reduce the backlog of cases by 90% by 2026, and to reduce the average time to complete the judicial procedures by 40% by 2026. So these are striking numbers. The reduction in the backlog by 90% is a huge number. The cost, we estimated that the upper bound is 4 billion euros, but it's probably less than that. Well, if you look at the estimated effect in the official documentation, is that it would bring an extra GDP of, this action alone would bring an extra GDP of 28 billion per year. Remember that the Italian GDP is 2 trillion per year. So in present discounted value terms, 28 billion per year, take a discount by a 5% interest rate. So that would amount to 600 billion per year. So 600 billion per year in higher GDP, so 600 billion in total, in present country value terms, on the positive side. On the negative side, you have the cost, which it's a one-off cost of 4 billion euros. So 4 billions against 600 billions. So this in itself sounds too good to be true. In addition, this reform didn't work because at least half of the people hired in February 2022 already resigned because the salary, as we'll see, was too low. If you look at the reform of the active labor market measures, it calculated that starting from 2031, it would bring about 70 billion per year, which is 1.5 trillion in present country value terms in total, with the cost, which is almost zero, because it would use professional the professionals in already existing in the various local governments. It should reach 3 million individuals, but there is no mention, no definition what it means to reach an individual. And in fact, we don't know exactly right now, and probably we will never know exactly what these measures are doing to the individuals that are reached. And there is no provision, certainly, to create the tens of thousands of professionals needed for such policies. So if you look at the school and research reform, it estimates that it will bring an extra GDP of 60 billion per year starting 2030, so at least 1.2 trillion in present country value terms, against a very small cost of a few billion euros. But the main item of the school reform, according to the government, the original plans, which was in the reform of the hiring and promotion of teachers based on their abilities, however measured, we know that it's a contentious issue, but based in some evaluation of the ability rather than seniority, this reform has not been implemented and will never be implemented. It has been killed and it's dead on arrival. So in total, the PNRR envisions 5 reforms with an estimated effect in present country value terms of 4 trillion, 2 times the Italian GDP, against minimal cost, a one-off cost of a few billions, again, one-off cost. So given these enormous positive effects, these reforms would actually reduce the deficit and the debt immediately because the cost is small and the effect is enormous. So given this, the first question is why wait for the PNRR? The Italian government is not liquidity constrained. It certainly would be able to spend a few billions more. If these effects are truly there, why wait for the PNRR? Now, we have been told that these reforms have been intentional and ambitious in order to stimulate somehow the country to succeed. We find it hard to believe that you can stimulate the country, whatever that means, to succeed in order to reach the targets of these reforms. Collective bodies don't work this way. What was missing was a lot of details. The devil is in the details. You don't plan these enormous reforms in a few months. Given that they have failed, attempts at doing this in the past have failed for the last 70 years. For instance, these are just examples. The reform of the justice system will never work without the organizational changes and the cooperation of the presidents of the tribunals. And the hiring and the reform of the hiring and promotion of teachers will not work without the agreements of the teachers' unions. Neither of these conditions were realized, but this should not have come as a surprise. It was well known in advance that the teacher unions would oppose these changes, and it was well known in advance that most presidents of tribunals were not interested or did not agree or did not have the ability to cope with these reforms. The PNRR also, in our view, suffers from wrong priorities. In our view, and of course this is subjective, the key problem of Italy right now is not introducing obsessive digitization in elementary schools, as an example, but it's problems of social exclusion, youth, and the banlieues in general in Italy. And when we say this, people typically say, well, we agree with that, but the remit of the PNRR is growth, potential growth, which is fine, and capital spending in general, which is fine, except that there is nothing in that says that if you address the issue of social exclusions, the banlieues, youth unemployment, and so on, that doesn't affect growth. We think that that would affect growth to a very large extent. As I mentioned, there is an obsession in the PNRR with the digitization in general, and this again, we think it's a problem which was forced upon the PNRR in large part by the European Commission and by Europe in general. There is an obsession with the digitization of everything, including schools, including elementary schools. We have examples in the book of this obsession. There is a lot of talk at the level of the elementary school even of things like metaverso, eduverse, artificial intelligence, neural networks, and these kind of things. But there is no, or virtually no, money for sport, integration, extracurricular activities. The new government cut, although this is not clear yet, 12 billion euros of spending on social spending. It cut about 6 billion of that amount to give it to the electricity monopoly in Italy, or near monopoly, for projects on so-called energy poverty, whatever that means. The combination of the enormous amount and the very short time to program it leads to necessarily to large amounts of distortions. To comply with the numerical targets, which are a positive aspect of the PNRR, often the government had to lower the standards. There are several examples, but one we provide two here. One is the research fund, the equivalent of the NSF in Italy, which has an explicit directive to lower the standards in order to reach an extra number of funded projects and spend the money quickly. The super bonus, which is the tax credit for working on your house, essentially renovating your houses, which is a huge amount of money, which pre-existed the PNRR but was funded by the PNRR and was given an extra lease of life by the PNRR, is another example of that. It was there, it's in the PNRR, although it has nothing to do with growth, of course, because the government needed to show that it could spend the money quickly. It's one of the most useless measures and one of the most costly measures. It's at the end of its life, it will probably cost about 100 billion euros, if not more. And a substantial amount of that, although nobody knows exactly how much yet, will come from the PNRR. Another problem of this approach is the lack of provisions for the maintenance of the project. Many capital projects do not foresee any funding for maintenance after 2026. And because of that, local authorities are reluctant to implement that because it's true that the PNRR would pay for a large amount of the capital investment, but after 2026, the cost of running these the new capital stocks at the local level will be mostly on local governments. Because of that, they are reluctant right now to implement them. In addition, many current expenditures will be one-off. The leading example is scholarships. There is a meritorious program to increase scholarships to university, but they will stop in 2026. And the same for extra PhDs. So it's a big burst for 4 years and then back to normal. The PNRR suffers, in our view, from what we call a teleological view. So we have been told by some high up people in the previous governments that it's true that it's set unrealistic targets, but that's because, as we mentioned before, then exactly because we set unrealistic targets, then we have to succeed. This to us is a bit of a curious, if not a truly twisted logic. So it's an all-in bet with 240 billion euros of the European taxpayer, largely of the Italian taxpayer. The reality of a country and the society doesn't change overnight just because the government introduces a PNR. The logic of the PNRR is that it combines investment and reforms. And the idea that has been widely publicized is that these are intertwined. So if reforms are not done correctly, the investment part will fail and vice versa. One implication of this is that has been publicized mostly by exponents of the previous governments, is that because someone doesn't want to implement the reforms or is not able to implement the reform, perhaps the current government, then the PNR is in trouble, but that's only because the current government doesn't want to implement the reforms. We think that this is a far-fetched conspiracy theory. So it is true, just to look at the political side a bit more, that the PNRR is largely an extraneous body to the current government. The current government doesn't feel that the PNRR is its creation. The biggest component of the current government didn't vote for the PNRR. It might not have all the competencies that are necessary to implement the PNRR. The Commission, the relationship with the Commission we know what it is, but that's a far cry from saying that this amounts to a boycott of the PNRR. And also, we think that this notion that investment fails because reforms are not done correctly is to a large extent an intellectual construction. For most investment, you don't really need reforms. You don't really need the reforms for the super bonus to work. Finally, there is the monitoring aspect, which is the one aspect on which everybody seems to agree, which is quite incredibly and irresponsibly, I would add, after 3 years, the accounting system and the monitoring system is not in place by a large amount. So we really don't know how much of the PNRR fund are spent and how they are spent, to the point that the audit court, in the second report of the PNRR, gave up. And they decided that it would focus on a small sample because it wasn't able to monitor the spending activity of the government. So this obviously means that both internal and external monitoring is extremely problematic, and there is a lack of informed public debate. These problems obviously are not new, but they, as far as we can tell, have not been addressed. The last point is, well, when you have so much money going around in so little time, there is always the danger that you will end up in the wrong hands. So these maps are the maps of, on the left-hand side, the intensity of spending of PNRR funds relative to GDP. And so Obviously, most of it is concentrated in the south because there is a provision that 40% of the funds of the PNRR have to go to the south of Italy. And so on the left-hand side, sorry, you have the index of the risk of corruption. On the right-hand side, you have the spending per capita, per PNRR spending per capita. So you can see that the two maps largely overlap, largely because of what I said, that by statute, most of them, at least 40% of the PNRR money has to go to the south. So of course, we don't mean to imply any causation, so you have to be careful in using these two maps together, but it's just an indication that you have to be careful. And the lack of monitoring and the lack of accounting of the PNRR just certainly doesn't help in this respect. So I will stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Roberto, also by sticking perfectly in time limit. You can stop sharing your screen so that we can see the full. Yes, perfect. And then we'll move on to Manuela. Manuela, you have 10 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, so you have to know that the basic unwritten rules for political scientists is never agree with an economist. So I hope you understand my shock when I found myself largely in agreement with not just one economist, but even two. So I have to say this is the starting point, and I still have to figure out whether I am more shocked or more scared about it. Anyway, since I'm not turning an economist anytime soon, be reassured that I have some questions left. But before that, I think that I have to start with the necessary praises here. Roberto and Tito's book is an extremely clear and a compelling read. You can agree or disagree with it, but the clarity of the message, the logic of the argument, and also the plain language, I really think the plain language also for the broad public, I would like to say, is definitely commendable. So I really enjoyed reading it. I also think that beyond the analysis on the resilient facility, I think the book really speaks to some fundamental questions for our democratic society. There is the question of democratic accountability, so how governments spend the money. There is the question about the future of Europe, which I think are, of course, extremely important issues to be discussed. Having said that, and as I anticipated, I think I have three major points, also for the sake of discussion here, right? So in order to help kick off a little bit the discussion. And my three major points have to do first with the diagnosis that is done in the book, okay, that of course Roberto has already summarized. The second major point is about the politics. And the third point is about the implications that the book arrived at. So what to do now, right, once that we are in this situation. So let me start with the diagnosis. As I said, I basically agree. I agree with Roberto and Tito that it is not so much a problem with the delays, but we have to go back and somehow think about the original sins. So the argument you heard that is that Italian governments were seduced by money somehow for all the reasons that Roberto summarized in his slides. The Italian government took not just more than they could handle, but more than was necessary, right? Also, especially in terms of loans. So I'm not here to justify the Italian governments, okay? Don't get me wrong. I don't want to justify the Italian governments and their relationship with Europe. But I think while I was reading it, I couldn't help but wondering whether responsibility need to be more equally shared between Italy and Europe, okay? Between the Italian governments and the European level. Okay, in the book, for instance, and you also mentioned it, Roberto, in your presentation, that the European Commission somehow encouraged, right, the Italian governments to follow through and to take the money. But I think that the problem is much bigger than that. I think that the problem is really about the design of the recovery and resilient facility, right? And it's probably in hindsight, I think it's necessary, and again, without taking away any responsibility from the Italian governments, but I think it's also time to think about the design of the recovery and resilient facility and whether it has some flaws, right, in how it is structured. So the culprits are not just the recipients, but also how the offer is done. Because, I mean, just let's think about it. What the Recovery and Resilient Facility did They put a lot of money on the table on a temporary basis and on a very short time frame. So there was no prospect, okay, no long-term future. The money was now, here, and I think that this design somehow creates an incentive for a gamble, right? Also because in the book you never mention it, but I think we also have to think about the overall economic architecture of the EU, the rules. You never mentioned the Stability and Growth Pact. So there was this one-off opportunity. We knew that the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact would have come out later. And so this all created an environment of gambling for resurrection. So what I'm trying to say here is that I completely buy your arguments on the mistakes that the Italian governments did. But I also think that, as it is often the case, there are also problems that have to do with the design at the European Union level. And of course, we can all say, of course, what happens at the European Union level was a political compromise on different political actors. It's better something than nothing, but still, how we set the incentives, right, as important implications later on. So what I really would like to say is that, okay, let's focus on the problems of the Italian governments, but probably we should also have a double thinking about how the Recovery and Resilience Facility was structured. Second point, the politics, the Italian politics. And it's a devil's advocate kind of question here. So in reading the book, you make this argument quite explicit. You kind of share the blame among all the three governments, right? The Conte government, then the Draghi government, and now the Meloni government. So they all have their share of responsibility. But my devil's advocate question would be, is some government more responsible than the others, right? Because of course you say that the Conte government took the money in the first place. Then there was the Draghi government, this relationship between reforms and investments, and now Meloni that doesn't feel ownership about the program, right? So I would really like to have your feedback. Okay, do you think that one of these three governments has more responsibility than the others? Now, as a reader, and probably I completely got it wrong, I think that when you discuss this nexus that also Roberto emphasized in his slide between reforms and investments, right? So how the Draghi government made the link explicit, kind of trapped Italy on its own cage. So may I conclude that you think that the Draghi government made an enormous mistake, more than the others probably? Third point on the implications, what to do next. Roberto and Tito somehow end up on a note, I won't say optimism, but possibility, right? That they say there are no legal obstacles for Italy to rethink its plan, to adjust and pedal back, right? It's if you want, it's a positive message. You're saying that the government has the possibility to rethink the status quo. But of course, and here is the political scientist in me that speaks, this is a very efficiency reasoning, okay? So just looking at efficiency, it would make much more sense to pedal back and rethink everything else. But I think that this perspective does not include the political and the societal perspective into account. First of all, I'm not entirely sure that pedaling back and scaling back the plan in Italy would buy supporters in Europe, neither in the European Commission, nor, we were chit-chatting before, neither in Amsterdam, and I would like to hear from David and the other here. I'm not sure that pedaling back would be interpreted as an instance of responsibility from Italy. I think it would be read as an instance of incompetence and a proof that Italy cannot spend its money. So and it's completely different than the thing that you are writing in the book, that because in the end you're saying, okay, Italy can pedal back and it would be a sign of responsibility. A country that cannot afford, that cannot spend properly, probably it's better if we bring back money. So I'm not entirely convinced. So this is for the European level. There would be enormous reputational costs. But there will also be enormous political costs, I think, domestically, because what the political situation now is that this money has been earmarked. Okay, it has been committed in some projects, and we have seen it when there has been the renegotiation with the Commission. Once you commit money, it's very difficult to pay it back. which is the government that wants to renege on a spending commitment, especially in a period in which we are constantly in an electoral campaign. So there are the European Parliament elections coming up, and then there will be some regional elections and whatever. So which is the government that really wants to pedal back from that? So I'm not saying that there is no alternative, okay? I do not buy also this there is no alternative argument thing, but I really do not see how these reputational costs in Europe and the political costs in Europe can be mitigated, and allowing any Italian government to restructure and shrinking the plan. Probably, I know that it's a gloomy note, but I think this is the political reality. And this inevitably leads me back to where I started. I would have never imagined to deliver a more dismal message than an economist. And I stop it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manuela. Very, very concise and very good comments. Just a short, because you addressed me specifically, there's of course the size that you can reduce, but there's also the final deadline in 2026, which you could perhaps prolong. That is also a lever to play with. If you want to say that you want to increase the quality of spending, perhaps you need a bit more time. Anyway, moving on to Laura, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here. I enjoyed the presentation, and I certainly enjoyed very much the book. And like Manuela, I also agree. As a political scientist, I must say I agree very much with the diagnosis. And well, congratulations are really due, because the book is really easy to read, as the authors said that they wanted to write a book which would be easy to read. And also it is obviously very clearly based on evidence and data. Every statement is explained clearly and justified with data. And most of all, I think that the book has the great merit of putting order to a very complex and indeed very ambiguous as well topic, which is the Italian NRRP. Because just as the authors underlined, there is a lot of lack of knowledge and uncertainty about the achievements reached so far, and about how implementation really is going vis-a-vis the expectations. I mean, we know when the installments are paid, but because of the lack of monitoring systems which present the full picture, it is really difficult to know exactly what is going on and how things are progressing. So this volume also has, I think, an added benefit, which is the fact that it deals with these topics of the RRP implementation and achievements in a very comprehensive way. And so it stands out from the academic articles, the scientific articles, which have written in abundance about the Italian RRP, but always focus on a specific part of the RRP, whereas here you have a full picture of both the investments and the reforms. So, it's a book I recommend reading, and also for the style, which is, as I said, not only easy to follow, despite the specialist nature, but also has hints of irony here and there, which makes it a pleasant read, I would say. So clearly, though, the view presented in the book is very critical of the choices that have been made by different Italian governments. And the conclusion, as we have heard, is that, it is likely that the Italian RRP, as it stands, and unless major structural reforms and revisions are carried out, it is not likely to succeed, clearly. And not only it would not be able to address the challenges that it was designed to respond to, but it will also end up penalizing our country and future generations by adding more load to Italy's already high public debt. So obviously this is a gloomy picture, as Manuela was saying, but I agree with the diagnosis. I mean, just to mention a few of the key things that come to mind is, first of all, this lack of adequate design, not only of the instrument, and I agree with Manuela on that, but also lack of adequate design of the plan itself, with imprecise definition of targets, for example, which are often overambitious, as we have heard, and vastly overambitious in some cases. The fact that there is an inadequate consideration of the existing levels of administrative capacity, and also how to respond to these, levels of inadequate administrative capacity in the definitions of these targets. This teleological vision of the reforms, this short circuit that basically sees reforms being necessary, and therefore, because they are necessary for the success of the plan, they will be done. Of course, it is not logical. And of course, this inability to focus on the right investments for the country by overplanning, for example, investments relating to digital agenda, but underplaying at the same time the investments in the social spheres, which I agree with the authors do actually contribute to growth. Not only that, if you read obviously the regulation of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, Article 4 says that the objective of the facility is to contribute to generating economic, social, and territorial cohesion. So the social dimension, of course, should be fundamental, not only for growth, but for the well-being of the citizens of this country. And of course, there's the issue of the lack of monitoring, transparency, accountability issues. And one aspect that I don't think has already been picked up in the discussion so far is this consideration, this, not so clear consideration of the territorial dimension of the investments, which the book actually writes about. And this, lack of foresight, of course, the not recognition that investments require running cost and maintenance cost even beyond 2026. So this is all very clear. And I agree, as I said, with these points, and I would just add a couple of reflections and very general questions for the authors. So the first question relates to this point. It strikes me a lot by reading your book and more generally that there is a lack of learning from the past. So I come from the perspective of having studied for many years EU cohesion policy. And, basically, it is obvious that the NRRP was put together in a period of high uncertainty. It was put together in a great rush, as we all know, as it was also recognized in the book. And it was put together, drafted under 2 successive governments and then revised by the current government. So, there have been a lot of sort of uncertainty and change over time. But, particularly since all the governments in question, taken together, cover all of the spectrum, all of the political spectrum of Italy, and all of them have been involved in some degree, whether in the regions or the national level, in the management and delivery of cohesion policy programs. I think it is really strange that the problems that are now being met in the RRP are the same problems that different rounds of evaluations of EU cohesion policy programs in Italy had already found out. So the problems are not new. And, so if these issues had already happened in the past, for example, the lack of recognition of the need to maintain infrastructures, this was something that past ex post evaluations have underlined for many years. Why was this not known and taken into account when the RRP was actually, drafted, even though it was drafted at a time of emergency, of course. So, and related to this, I think for me, even more so than, the fact that there has been a bad choice between public investments and the fiscal incentives. What seems to me to be the main problem of the Italian RRP, and I don't know if the authors agree with me, is the fact that there is no strategy. So again, coming from the perspective of cohesion policy, you have programs, with clearly spelled out objectives, resources allocated to deliver those objectives in a given time frame. Whereas the RRP seems to be really a sum of different not related parts. And so there lacks an overarching strategy. And so, my question is, beyond the specific achievements of milestones and targets and the payments of the various installments by the Commission related to these achievements, what will be evaluated at the end? What is the actual expected impact of the RRP beyond growth in terms of GDP? There is no strategy. So what can we evaluate success about? And a further element that strikes me is the fact that clearly the plan is marred by very serious flaws that the book clearly describes and analyzes. But, and again, I attach here to what Manuela was saying, but from a different angle. So clearly the plan was drafted by the Italian government, but it was also negotiated with the Commission. So, the Commission is mentioned in the volume, for example, with the setting of the threshold for digital investments, or with reference to the case of the students' accommodation, with the terza rata. But more generally, I wonder, what is the view of the authors in relation to the fact that, the Commission had to approve first the plan and then as to oversee its implementation. So if the plan entails such generic milestones for the reforms and targets that are so clearly unachievable for the investments, how is it possible that the Commission did not detect this when it approved the plan, and now that it oversees the implementation? Why did the Commission not raise issues with this problem, which is a major flaw of the plan, in my view, as well? And then a third element, which I think is important and that you show in your book, is that despite the 40% earmarking of investments for the Mezzogiorno, the way in which the investments themselves have been designed can mean that those territories that can take advantage from them might also be those territories who need them the least. So in the book, the case of nurseries, for example, is exemplar. So the need to create new nurseries places is most acute, of course, in the south of Italy. And in fact, the recent SVMET annual report showed that, for example, 7 out of 10 women in working age in Italy do not work. So of course, nurseries would be very, very relevant, in that part of the country. Yet the municipalities in the south, as you discussed, cannot afford to build new nurseries because they know that they would not have the money to then, staff those nurseries and maintain them in the longer term. And now this, I wanted to just bring together an argument, well, a question from the more recent developments in the Italian Senate, which has just approved a draft reform of the so-called differentiated autonomy. So, the NRRP, this draft reform clearly show a lack of territorial sensitivity in practice, by the Italian governments. And so, what is your view? What does this tell for the future of the country? I know these are very general questions, but I think they're interesting for the discussion. And the last question is this. I mean, at the end of the day, to me at least, the key message that came out from the book is the fact that there is a deafness by the Italian ruling classes, the Italian ruling elites from whichever political family they come from, to problems that actually are already well known to us, analysts of public policy, and an inability to think with vision and also, to act bravely by saying, okay, we renounce to some of the loans, for example, because we know that we won't deliver. And so, what the book really is about to me is the lack of competent leadership, political leadership. And so where do we go from here, basically? How do we change this? I know it's a massive question, but I wanted to, open up the floor with big questions. So thank you very much for an excellent book.
Thank you very much, Laura. Meanwhile, we will go back to Roberto and Tito for a round of answers. But meanwhile, can I ask people to indicate, please, in the chat if they want to ask a question? I see that nobody has yet indicated this. So please do let me know. Who can I give the floor? Tito.
Okay, yeah, perhaps because also I have to leave, I'm afraid, in a few minutes. So first of all, thank you so much for this opportunity to present and discuss our book. And thank you for Manuela and Laura for the really very, very insightful comments and very, very useful. I have to say that I learned a lot from your comments and what you said. And your questions are all extremely challenging and really are very interesting for us. Let me react rather quickly. I'm sure that Roberto will have to say more about these issues on the various points that were raised. First of all, on the diagnosis. No, I certainly agree that there was a problem also on the side of the Commission, and the problems were of various types. One clearly was also brought about by Laura, was the fact of not learning from the experience of the structural funds. So that clearly was a clear show that investment expenditure is very different than transfer spending, and that requires time to be done properly. And clearly, such a large amount of funds could not be spent if were in such a short time period, given the type of orientation that this fund had to accomplish. One has at the same time to take into account that the plan, the Next Generation EU, was built in quite different historical conditions, suppose we are currently living. So we were just in the middle of the pandemic. We had to organize the recovery, and clearly, so the idea was really to bring inside the political agenda at the European level, not only monetary policy, but also fiscal policies that were, and the consensus were reached only on doing this in terms of public investment rather than also transfer. It would have made some sense also to spend more in terms of transfers at that stage. But I think the key problems with the Commission were in the enforcement rather than simply the design of the Next Generation EU. Enforcement, I mean, first of all, the fact that in a dialogue with individual governments, they should have raised some concern about this greed, I don't know how to define it, of Italian government and this idea of getting as much money as possible, given the very high level of debt that we had. Perhaps there was a problem of selling of a new scheme, and they clearly were interested that the governments were asking as much as possible. But there could have been ways to do that. Simply saying, okay, you don't need to make a decision right now. You have all the time to do so, because there was time until August 2023. It was possible to decide upon the scale of a plan and decide how much loans to take, which is clearly the critical part. Because the grant component, of course, it goes without saying, is something that all governments have been taking. But that would have been, I think, a preferable way of proceeding. And so in that respect, I think that the Commission could have said, listen, you don't need to decide everything right now. You take your time, think about how to use it in a way, and we will interact, and be careful, because these are loans, not only grants. Politics. And the sharing of responsibility across governments. We didn't talk about this, Roberto and myself, so maybe he has different views. And by the way, you were saying before about political scientists and the economists. Another saying about economists is that if you put 5 economists around the table, you have 10 different views. So it's likely that Roberto will have different views in this respect. But my personal view is that most of the mistakes were done by the Conte II government, because the decision to take all the money immediately without having any idea of how to spend it, and the summit that was organized in Villa Borghese was a clear show, a demonstration of the fact that no idea was there how to use it. That was clearly the recipe for troubles. Later on, clearly the Draghi government could have used the credibility the government had at the European level to, in a way, reduce the plan and revisit some of the ideas that were initially put forward. But that was already a difficult task, as you rightly pointed out. To downscale a plan is not an easy task. It's way easier to start first being less ambitious. Another thing that I think was something that was not considered at all, and it is an additional reason why this plan should be done over time and not immediately. You can't pretend to do everything immediately. Is the fact that this strategy, this plan, should be shared across different legislatures. It involves potentially different governments. So clearly, it's not by chance that the current government for a long time has not been thinking that this was their plan. So in a way, leaving some room for doing additional components of a project, expecting that possibly some changes in the majority could have been taking place, especially given that we are in Italy, would have been something sensible to do, and something also, again, the Commission could have said something in this respect. In terms of the implication, yeah, I agree. Again, it won't be that popular to say, well, we don't do everything, but I think that could also be explained, and in various domains, the fact of being very careful in terms of the budget and of the debt would be important, and may also have positive effect on market and perception about Italy and on the cost of debt. But another way to say that we reduce the scale of a project is to really postpone a lot of this action, and work more on the timing of the implementation than on anything else. And I think we would get support also at the European level, because many other governments seem to be really experiencing delays in the implementation. And this goes back to what we were saying at the beginning about the lesson that we have not learned from the structural funds. So I think if Italy brings about the issue of the timing of implementation and asks for postponement of some actions and adapt some changes in the plan, that would be also somehow would find support from other governments in Europe. By the way, another thing that it's important and has not been made clear often is the fact that if Italy decide to reduce the scale of a plan or to change, this would have impact only on the loan component of a plan, not on the grant component of a plan. So that is important to be said. On the as you asked at the end about the law that was approved yesterday, I think for the time being is simply an empty framework. We will be able to say something sensible about the fiscal federalism and the differential autonomy in Italy once we will have a clear measurement of the so-called LEP. This is really what we need to know before making any assessment about the implication of this. So I think there is a lot of ideological discussion now taking place. Unless we know what the LEP are, it is not possible to make any assessment about what are the implication of this reform on the provision of services. And, decentralization in spending has already been done in very important area. Health is clearly the most important area where this has been done, and is one of the areas where clearly is more sensible for people. In a way, I think that there is a lot of ideological reaction to this reform. It's too early to say what are the implications of it. And I'm very much sorry, but there was a problem, misunderstanding about timing of a seminar I have to give at the IMF, and so I have to leave you. And but I'm sure that Roberto will tell me about the discussion, the interesting discussion we had. And thank you again for this opportunity and the wonderful comments you gave us.
Many thanks, Tito. Thanks for being here. Good luck with your next presentation. Roberto.
I don't have much to add relative to what Tito said. Let me thank the discussants for the comments, very useful and interesting comments. I don't have much to add to what Tito said, so maybe in the interest of the discussion, I will abstain from making further remarks. Maybe I will take them up later if there is more time.
Okay, we don't actually have so many questions so far, so I do encourage everyone to ask me a question or to indicate in the chat that you want to ask a question. We do have one from Lorenzo Maschioli. Lorenzo.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much, Roberto. And Tito just left us, so of course I extend my thanks to him. I'm a PhD researcher here at the UI, and during the fall of 2023, I conducted some field trips to Italian municipalities to investigate, among other things, how the recovery plan, how the PNRR is being implemented. And based on this experience, which of course is quite idiosyncratic, it's not based on large numbers, I must say that I tend to agree with most of the arguments being put forth. But however, I wonder whether they may also be on the positive side, a sort of positive productivity effect of the instrument on local public administration. So based on what I see, it seems to me that, of course, many local public servants are complaining. Some of them told me that they hate this new instrument, especially as compared to cohesion policy. But at the same time, I saw some of them generally panicking, and some bureau officers being seriously concerned and being afraid of disappointing the relevant ministry. And some have told me that, for example, they have increased their working hours, they have been asked to take more risk or to streamline procedures. In other words, it seems to me that this instrument for some public administration at the local level has been something of a shock therapy. Of course, an intended byproduct of its original design, but something that could have achieved only through this sheer mass and due to this sense of urgency, which was strongly conveyed from the beginning. Something that I understand never happened with cohesion policy, which operates under much more relaxed conditions. Of course, there is no certainty that this will endure over time, even if it's there. But I was wondering what you think about this.
Thank you, Lorenzo. And I'll take a few more. We have Eric Jones, who's saying that the analysis is very depressing. I agree. He says, I have a slightly unfair question. If this analysis is correct, and no doubt it is, can the government and the Commission nevertheless declare victory at the end of this process and walk away claiming it is a success? I also see Simona Piattoni. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, this is a slightly lateral question, but I wonder, there has been a lot of debate about good and bad debt. And the distinction between the two apparently is between debt that pays for investment, which then produces growth, and bad debt that does not do that, is simply redistribution. Now, is it really possible to distinguish between the two? And does the National Resilience and Recovery Resilience Plan distinguish between the two? For example, you know, the issue of schools. It is about building you know, kindergarten, schools, etc., you know, structural, you know, physical structures, but how much is really devoted then to, you know, human capital, or vice versa, in health, improving people's health by allowing people to access, you know, sooner the National Health Service? Is it good or bad investment? It could be very good. It could be seen also as redistribution. What do you think of that? You know, is it a logical, a plausible, and a distinguishable economic category? Thanks.
Thank you. I'll take one more. Stefano.
Yes, thank you very much for this great presentation. It was very interesting for me. And I have a question sort of with a more of a bird's eye view. Of course, if we compare the Recovery and Resilience Facility as a response to the COVID crisis, we then can draw a comparison, for example, with the Euro crisis and what was done in that case. So my idea would be that on a political level, from the perspective of the Commission, this surge in fiscal expenditure can actually, it may not cause sort of long-term economic growth, but it can, in a way, sort of sterilize a potentially very adversarial government, like could be the actual Meloni government. And so there could be some political gains, even if the overall design is rather ineffective. And also, on the economic side of it, within the bad outlook that we have for this Italian NRRP, what would be Professor Perotti's idea as a comparison with the response to the Euro crisis? Would you rank this answer to the crisis as a sort of still better than the previous one, or do you have a different idea? Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Roberto, back to you.
Yeah, thank you. So let me take up the questions in sequence. The first one by Lorenzo was on the shock therapy to the local government. Yes, I agree with you. The little evidence that we have collected from a very small sample also agrees with this interpretation, but there is shock therapy and shock therapy. So I agree with you that many local governments found themselves in a situation of close to chaos. Now, whether that stimulates a positive reaction or a reaction that you have to have, but it's not necessarily positive, I'm not sure. So it seems to me that in any case, this must be a very indirect effect. And it must be a very costly way of employing the 240 billion euros. So if your real goal was to make local governments more effective, then it cannot be the case that you throw 240 billion euros at them and then say it's a win. And so I agree with you that in some cases it might have had that side effect. In many cases, it might have had the effect of stimulating them to spend in any way. And I know for a fact that this, as I professor in my small hometown, I know for a fact that the small amount of money that has come to the local government has been spent in a hurry in completely useless project. And they know that they're useless, but they know that they have to show that they're spending the money quickly. So it must be a very indirect way, assuming that the effect is positive, to generate this positive effect. So the question by Eric, can the Italian government and the European Commission claim victory, even though in the end the program was a failure in some terms? Yes, that can happen, and that will happen. The problem with these programs is that you don't have a objective metric to evaluate them. So how do we know whether it was worthwhile from the point of view of society to spend these 240 billion euros in the end? We will never really know because we don't have a counterfactual. So I agree with you that the Commission and the government, Italian government, whoever is the government at the time, will never say sorry. We made you spend 240 billion euros. It was a failure. They will always claim victory. But the metrics to evaluate these are first subjective, second there are many of them. So you will always find some dimension in which this will plausibly be a success. The question by Simona, this is an interesting question. I think there are two aspects. One is that most of the spending of the PNRR has to be capital spending, and for a number of reasons, mostly because the program, the NextGenerationEU program, was born with two different missions. One was to stimulate the economy out of the COVID recession. And the second one was to say, well, we are not throwing money at useless projects, we are throwing money at growth. So it was a difficult combination because it had to be anti-cyclical, counter-cyclical, and at the same time it had to be pro-growth. So it had to be most investment. But the second point is that we tend to have an obsession with the notion of investment, with the label of investment. What is considered a capital good from a national income accounting point of view is not necessarily more conducive to growth than some current spending. So we might tend to think that pension spending is not particularly conducive to growth. That doesn't mean that you don't want to have pensions. Pensions are important to hold the society together. That we tend to think that they don't, pension spending doesn't lead to growth necessarily, although I'm sure you can find reasons why it would, and some of them might be plausible. But what we label investment from a national income accounting point of view is not necessarily the only way to achieve growth, and it's not necessarily a way to achieve growth. So you can argue that current spending to integrate immigrants in the long run, even in the medium run, is conducive to more growth than what is actually investment from a national income accounting point of view in some railway line which nobody uses. This is actually something that is at the root of the debate in Italy, I suspect even in other countries. We have found that lots of people from all parts of the political spectrum tell us, look, this is for the first time is good spending because it stimulates growth, because it's investment. But again, there is a lot of spending on railway lines, which have all the geopolitical motivations. If you look at the distribution, the geographical distribution of railway line, it's totally uniform geographically. Some of these lines don't make sense from a cost-benefit point of view analysis, and they will not stimulate growth. While we argue, we don't have proof, of course, that some spending, current spending on integration of immigrant youth or unemployed youth in general would stimulate growth in the medium and long run much more than railway spending. So we don't buy this notion that because the recovery fund is mostly on investment goods from a national income accounting point of view, it's necessarily good, and it's different from the past. I don't buy that logic at all. And the question by Stefano, I'm not sure I understood your point that it might, however good or bad it might be, it might help sterilize adversarial governments like the Meloni government. I'm not sure I understood exactly what you meant.
Well, I meant that, for example, there has been a lot of studies on the welfare reforms advocated by radical right populist parties, and a government like the Meloni government, in theory, should have a policy preferences with regard to, for example, welfare reforms, which, in the absence of this big pot of money, could maybe pursue. And, for example, in the field of pensions or on a different form of labor market reforms. So that could be sort of a benefit, quote unquote. I'm trying obviously to find a good side to look at the NRRP that this program can have.
So you're saying because the current Italian government has to spend this enormous amount of money, it cannot spend money on other programs that would be detrimental to growth or in general to the welfare of society. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that if they, for example, signal a super generous pension reform like it was promised, then they would incur into sort of the Commission's what's the right term? Sort of they would incur problems in the recurring series of tranches that they have to receive by the Commission. The Commission could assume a harder stance with regards to the Italian National Recovery and Resilience Plan, and so they hold a sort of power over possibly adversarial senses.
Yeah, I'm not sure because this is one thing that I didn't mention in the presentation, but is something that I think is important to note, that one effect of the PNRR, this enormous amount of money being allocated to Italy, is that despite the fact that we have meaning us Italians, we have just been given this enormous amount of money from the European, by the European taxpayer, 240 billion euros. 2 years after that, the Italian government, the new Italian government, was scraping the bottom of the barrel, and it was claiming there was no money. How come there is no money? We have just received 240 billion euros courtesy of the European taxpayer. And the reason is, of course, that the current government couldn't care less about most of the projects in the PNRR, which was approved by governments that it doesn't recognize itself into. So I'm not sure that it prevents the current government from implementing its projects. And I'm not sure, actually, to be honest, that it would be the right thing to do, in quotes, because I think the Italian government, the current Italian government, has been voted in by the majority of the population, at least in parliament. And I think it has the right to implement its policies. So I'm not sure that it's the business of the European taxpayer to decide which government should be allowed and which government should not be allowed.
I was not advocating for that in the least. I was just sort of it was not a normative sort of assessment. it was just sort of an idea. I definitely don't advocate this personally.
Yeah, no, it might be that it slightly constrains the Italian government a bit, because it cannot ignore completely the fact that it's dealing with a program amounting to 240 billion euros, but it certainly subjectively doesn't feel itself bound by the program, and you can see that essentially Meloni herself has never mentioned the PNRR in a public speech, never, which means something. And the last point you made, comparing the PNRR to the response to the euro crisis. Well, to me, there are two responses to the euro crisis by the European Commission. In 2011, it strongly encouraged governments to retrench, to do austerity measures. And then after 6 months or 1 year, it said, sorry, we were wrong. You should apply an expansionary fiscal policy. So I'm not sure exactly which one we should take as a yardstick. I think in retrospect, it was not the best performance by the European Commission, either one. I think the idea behind this program was not completely wrong. So there was a recession which was temporary, and so it made sense to have a counter-cyclical fiscal policy. It made sense to have it implemented quickly. The problem was that it was too much for Italy. It was just too much. Too fast, too much.
Thank you very much. I see there are no further questions in the chat, so I'll just pop in a few of my own. I mean, responding to what you just said about the size, and I do buy your argument that it was too much for Italy. But if we look at the European level, all the NRRP ever did was bring back net public investment levels to what we had before the euro crisis. The real outlier has been years and years of underinvestment in Europe. So don't you think that one of the key problems we're facing here is that governments have for many years also cut down on their expertise in how to correctly or how to proficiently do public investment projects? That is one. Second, I mean, there were already quite a few questions asked about the European Commission, and I second some of the concerns here. I want to push you a little bit further, because the novelty was not just a big pot of money and European Commission involvement, but also the governance. So there's a new governance system where monitoring was supposed to be based on results, where the Italian government was asked to detail the plans upfront, and was asked upfront to have to detail all the requirements for audit and control. So what did you come across in terms of people's views on this on this new approach? It seems, because some of the fears in performance-based financing was that it would lead to paper-based implementation, where numbers and output on paper are more important than underlying goals. And when I read your book, you seem to sort of go in this direction. The interesting thing is that if we do interviews throughout Europe, we get a lot of criticism in various member states, but not among Italian officials. Italian officials that we talk to are very enthusiastic about this approach, saying that it leads to a lot of professionalism and that it's actually, you know, leading to higher quality. So that's also one of the things I had in mind. Another aspect you also just mentioned in your comments is about the Meloni government, and I was indeed a bit shocked to read and also to hear from you now that Meloni has never mentioned or never mentions the PNR in her speech. The Italian government was allowed to make quite a lot of changes. We saw that actually last year in the revisions that have happened because of Repower EU, no other government had made so many changes to their plan as the Italian government. Do you think this has helped in any way increase the ownership, or have they simply just taken away money from the municipalities and re-centralized spending? And finally, I I know you said, our book, we don't want to talk about the delays today, but I do wonder, what can we expect in terms of implementation by 2026? Do you expect the Italian plan to be implemented half, 60%, 40%? What are your expectations?
Thank you.
And please also feel free to pick up some of the questions that were left.
Yeah. So first question, yeah, it's true that one effect of the Next Generation EU was to get investment levels, public investment levels back to pre-Euro crisis levels. But again, that's investment from a national income accounting point of view. So again, to make the example I made before, if you build a railway line which has virtually no customers, you do increase investment from a national income point of view, in a national income accounting point of view. Is that welfare increasing from the point of view of society? Or is it even growth increasing? I'm not sure at all. So the point I'm making is that not all investments are necessarily good for growth itself, let alone for welfare. And certainly planning these investments in a hurry doesn't help in this respect. In a big hurry doesn't help in this respect. The second question was the European Commission, the role of the European Commission. I think that the design of the PNRR is positive in many respects. So the fact that you have milestone and targets, and here I'm not entirely in agreement with Laura, because I think there is a positive aspect in this, which is it's not really true that there is no strategy. The yardstick against which the PNRR will be judged will be exactly the targets that have been set by the quantitative targets that have been set by the European Commission and the Italian government. And so now you can argue that in some cases there is room for maneuvering around these targets. But I think this is a positive. So a very strict deadline and very tightly defined targets, numerical, quantitative targets. So in this respect, I think this is a positive aspect of PNRR. And I don't have much to add to this. I think it is positive. It's the rest that is not positive. The question about, so you said the Italian officials are all enthusiastic. Well, they just received 240 billion from the European taxpayer, so I'm not particularly surprised that they are enthusiastic. I'm not even
about the methodology, but
sorry.
They're enthusiastic about the methodology. So
yeah,
the style.
Yeah, no, but the methodology comes with the money, so it's hard to distinguish one from the other, right? But I agree. So it is positive relative to what was happening in Italy before that. So we cannot forget about that. So I think it's a positive aspect of PNRR. The third question was about the changes by the current government. I think overall, I regard them as positive because they took, they recognized reality. The reality was that some of the spending items were not feasible and they had to be cut. Some of the spending items were much more expensive than originally planned. So for the same amount of nominal money allocated to the project, the physical amounts, for instance, of kindergartens, buildings, had to be reduced because the cost of construction had increased. And so it recognized all these aspects of reality, and it was a big step forward, I think, which should have been taken by the previous government, by the way. And it also managed to slip in some other changes that were not so positive. but I think to a large extent it was a positive development. And finally, the question about delays. I think in the end, the money will be spent, and maybe with 1 year there will be a negotiation for extending the deadline by 1 year and so on. Maybe as I said, the targets will be maneuvered around with some clever trick, and I think this is unavoidable. But the money will be spent, and here I slightly disagree with the interpretation that returning the money would be interpreted as a sign of weakness and failure and irresponsibility. I'm not so sure. I'm ambivalent on this. I don't know the answer for sure, of course, but I'm ambivalent. I recognize this possibility, but I also think that if the Draghi government at the time, so the Draghi government comes after the Conte II government, which was clearly an inexperienced government that was tricked, I think, by the Commission into accepting 240 billion euros without knowing how to spend them. So the Draghi government had said at the time, look, we are much more competent than these guys. We have a huge political capital to spend because Draghi could have walked on water at the time in Brussels. So we have realized that there were mistakes made by the previous government. We want to correct them. I'm not sure that this would be interpreted. This would have been interpreted as a failure of Italy. I think it possibly would have been interpreted as, for the first time, Italy shows that it's responsible in its spending habits. Maybe, I'm not sure, but it's a possibility. I'm not so convinced that there is no way that the Italian government could not have reduced spending relative to the original plan. So the money will be spent eventually, but again, in a sense, this is the problem, because spending money on the wrong projects is not a big achievement.
On that note, I want to thank Eric Jones and the Schuman Center for hosting us. I want to thank Manuela and Laura for taking the time to read the book and sharing your insights with us. It was very, very enlightening. Above all, I want to thank Roberto for his presentation and his answers. I can only hope that others in other countries also pick up this challenge of writing these kinds of books so that we can learn about implementation and implementation obstacles and start comparing also. Thank you everyone for your questions and for attending this workshop. Have a good evening.